Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this annual ceremony. For almost 30 years, Canadians have come together to commemorate the lives of 14 women murdered in Montreal on December 6, 1989, simply for being women. While our format may be a little bit different this year, in our new virtual world, their memories live strong and in our hearts and in our minds. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge Toronto as the traditional gathering place of many Indigenous nations, with a brief video graciously provided by the Centre for Wise Practices for Indigenous Health here at Women's College Hospital.
Ani, bonjour. Sarah Indishnakas. Shebenaning and Donjaba, Takaranto and Dai. Takaranto, a Mohawk word, the place in the water where the trees are standing, the place where the fish weirs are. My dog and I spend a lot of time walking. It's my favorite way to move through this city. For me, it's a meditative action that isn't about negotiating bike lanes or public transit, but a time to slow down and really try to see the world around me. Concrete sidewalks, parking lots, now covering the rivers and trails that once flowed freely. The Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Métis, the Mississaugas all made their homes here. And many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think of the other First Peoples' languages and the names they had for this place. I think of the ancient trails covered by the pressures of settlement. The waterways and the moderate climate of the Great Lakes made it a perfect place to fish, hunt, grow food, gather medicines and seeds for horticultural development. Rich, fertile, and abundant, Turtle Island's Mesopotamia. Many First Peoples and their goods traveled from here all the way to the Mississippi and back. Whenever I travel somewhere new, I try to find out whose land I'm on, and I ask, who are the original occupants here? So for Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only to assert our sovereignty and treaty rights of today, but it's also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Davenport might be a street now, one I walk down regularly in my neighborhood, but it's not just another thoroughfare. For me, it's an ancient portage trail that holds Indigenous knowledge. They say the animals made the first trails that led them to water, and the people followed. I imagine the deer and the moose once made this trail, followed by the people carrying their birch bark canoes, carrying their goods to trade, and bringing stories to tell. Nations from all over Turtle Island met and traveled through this land. Many languages were spoken. Alliances and decisions were made. People from different nations met and intermarried. The dish with one spoon treaty was made. Takaranto was a meeting place and land made up of sophisticated and cosmopolitan peoples and cultures that I see reflected in the city today. I wonder, is it something in the land and the water? Land acknowledgements might seem like a small and simple gesture, but like many of our ways, they are intended to have more impact and hold more meaning than the words alone. If we pride ourselves on diversity and equality, shouldn't our story include Indigenous peoples? In this era of reconciliation, we need to share the truth first. And reimagine the narrative of this land and this city together.
As I mentioned, our format is a little bit different this year. While it's important to comply with all the safety protocols to limit the spread of COVID-19, we also felt it was important to continue to remember the victims of that tragic day in December 1989, as well as all the women across the province whose lives were cut short because of violence. So today, I'm in a large auditorium that holds more than 200 people with just 3 others who are here to help run this virtual event. They are all masked, and we are more than 6 feet apart. While we are apart, we by no means are alone. Today, several leaders will be bringing us remarks, and 17 people from across the city helped us pre-record our rose holder ceremony from their homes and their offices. We also have Dr. Tanya Sharp, founder and director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, joining us for a live keynote address. Entitled Roll of Thunder, Hear Our Cries, Dr. Sharp will draw on her expertise in examining the coping strategies of Black family members who have survived homicide of a loved one, discuss the disproportionate representation of Black female survivors of homicide victims, the devastating impact this has on Black female family members and friends, and share insights on how they cope with these experiences. During her presentation, we will also take questions through the Q&A feature, which will be answered at the end of the keynote. I really encourage you to participate in this. As with an in-person event, often the Q&A component offers a rich discussion, and I hope we can continue this even in the virtual world. In Canada, a woman is murdered by her intimate partner every 6 days. The perpetrators of violence against women are almost always men. They are their victims' boyfriends and husbands, their brothers, and their fathers. They are young and old, of varying cultural and religious backgrounds, and from every socioeconomic level. The women they victimize are equally diverse. However, research shows us that some women are especially at risk. Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be killed by their partner than non-Indigenous women. For women living with a disability, 60% experience some form of violence in their lifetime. Immigrant women tend to be more vulnerable to domestic violence due to economic dependence, language barriers, and a lack of access to community resources. Statistical data about violence against Black women in Canada are largely not available, even though we know they are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. This lack of data renders their experiences invisible. Violence against women is a public health issue and an all too common crime. During the pandemic, we've all been told to stay home to stay safe. But we know that home is not a safe place for everyone. For many, the pandemic has worsened the cycles of abuse and increased the vulnerability of women. It is incumbent on all of us to do everything we can to stop these societal patterns. As government, healthcare, and community leaders, we must come together and work towards strategies to break the cycle of violence and protect those who are most vulnerable to their effects. Many of you in the audience today are on the front lines and know these statistics all too well because you are the ones helping the victims of violence. You are often the ones caring for women at the height of crisis, not only attending to their healthcare needs, but also ensuring they feel heard, reassured, and have a safe place to go. You are caregivers, advocates, and someone to lean on. The work you do is invaluable. You have always faced challenges and circumstances, this year more than ever, but you continue to stand up and put the needs of others first, and we are eternally grateful. Thank you for your caring and your compassion. As I mentioned, a number of honored guests are joining us and have provided messages to share with you. To begin, I would like to welcome the Honorable Carolyn Bennett, MP for Toronto St. Paul's and Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, who joins us today to share a few remarks. Welcome, Minister Bennett.
Thank you so much, Heather, for the invitation, your beautiful words, and thank you to Dr. Lisa Richardson and the Center for Wise Practices for Indigenous Health for that truly beautiful land acknowledgement, but also for all the transformational work that you are doing here at Women's and across the country to address systemic racism and ensure that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have safe spaces to receive their health care. Today we gather to commemorate and address the deadly misogyny that happened 31 years ago and recognize that unfortunately it is still with us. From Portapique to the court proceedings on the van attack in North York, our hearts are with the families and the survivors. Since December 6th, 1989, Women's College Hospital recognized the need to come together for a day of remembrance and action in honor of those 14 brilliant women who had died only because they were women. I remember that first ceremony. I remember the roses, the banner, a packed auditorium of women and men. We had tried to hold an exhibition of art in the halls as an expression of the feelings and quickly had to move the exhibition into the boardroom as it was so triggering to so many. I remember 10 years later the remarks of Margie McCain, who linked child abuse with perpetrators. It shocked many. But as we have learned through the gatherings on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, hurt people hurt people. In our work with the families and survivors of MMIWG2S+, we know that their voices are essential to putting in place the concrete measures to stop this tragedy. The loss of their daughters and sisters and mothers, aunties and grandmothers. They are the center of the work we are doing with all partners to respond to the National Inquiry. Today, we honor the families of those women lost December 6th, 1989. Those families have never stopped fighting for gun control. And yesterday, the Prime Minister honored them in the House of Commons by saying, Mr. Speaker, the gun lobby doesn't like it when we use the word assault weapon. They say it's a meaningless term. Well, let me tell you that it's not meaningless. The lives of the people we have lost to these weapons. Canadians know that there's no place in our country for weapons designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. And that's why in May we announced the ban on 1,500 models of assault-style weapons, including the Ruger Mini 14 used by that killer in Montreal on December 16th, 1989. Today, we thank the families of École Polytechnique and all the families and survivors of gender-based violence for their advocacy, as together we work towards a truly national action plan against gender-based violence. And we thank, as always, Women's College Hospital for your ongoing leadership. Non quo sed quo modo. It's not only what you do, but how.
Thank you, Minister Bennett, for joining us today and for your ongoing support of our community. I would now like to introduce the Honourable Christine Elliott, Deputy Premier and Minister of Health, who has graciously taken time to share some remarks with us.
Hello, everyone. I am Christine Elliott, Ontario's Deputy Premier and Minister of Health. December 6th is a National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. On this day, 31 years ago, the lives of 14 young women were taken at l'École Polytechnique in Montreal in a tragedy that shook our country unlike anything else. These women had dreams, hopes, and bright futures. Today, we honor the memory of these women and all those who have experienced gender-based violence. Violence and discrimination against women and girls is and always will be unacceptable. Thank you to Women's College Hospital for hosting today's commemorative rose ceremony and giving all of us a chance to reflect and learn about what we can do to help prevent and address gender-based violence. Together, we can build a more accepting and inclusive Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Elliott. We all know how challenging this past year has been, and we are grateful for your leadership and support as we, as a health system, respond to the pandemic. I would now like to introduce the Honourable Jill Dunlop, Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, and Associate Minister responsible for women's issues.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here today. Nearly 31 years ago, on December 6, 1989, the lives of 14 women were brutally taken away. These women were primarily young engineering students working towards careers in a field where women were and are still underrepresented. The perpetrator didn't know them, but their choice to study engineering made these women targets. His ingrained misogyny and hatred led him to this horrific act simply because they were women. It is our solemn duty each year at this time to acknowledge the humanity of the 14 lives tragically cut short. The silence and secrecy that used to shroud the issue of violence against women is a fact of history that can never be repeated. This is a societal issue that is now out in the open, never to be concealed again. We commemorate these 14 women every December, but in their honor, we need to ensure that we are talking about gender-based violence every day. It is not enough to say it once a year. It needs to be said every single day. Gender-based violence is unacceptable and cannot be tolerated. And while it is important to raise awareness, it is even more important to act. To all the women and girls who've experienced violence, I want to let you know that your voices are being heard, and we stand with you. To the families and friends of women whose lives were tragically cut short due to violence, your voices are being heard, and we stand with you. I speak to you today not just as the Minister of Children and Women's Issues, but as a woman and a mother to 3 daughters. And I want to assure you that our government understands our role in combating violence against women. We will continue to fund crucial services like emergency shelters, counseling, 24-hour crisis lines, safety planning, and transitional and housing supports in both urban and rural areas, because violence against women knows no boundaries. And we will continue to speak with survivors and frontline staff to understand the evolving needs of those experiencing violence. We can never let what happened to these 14 women happen again. It is every woman's fundamental right to live safely and securely in our communities, free from abuse of any kind. Every year we host vigils, we place roses, and we light candles to pay our respects to these 14 women. Let's promise them that each and every day we will do better in their memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Dunlop, for sharing your message and your commitment to our hospital and the health of women. We know that there's a long road ahead in addressing the many inequities and issues facing women, particularly Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. And we are grateful for your support in this journey. I would now like to introduce His Worship, Mayor John Tory.
Thank you to Women's College Hospital for once again hosting a commemoration of the violent loss of 14 young women simply because they were women on that sad day in Montreal. I want to also thank you for finding a way to put together this ceremony while following the public health guidelines. Although today's ceremony is virtual, it is still important for us to gather. The pandemic that we're still experiencing once again laid bare just how prevalent violence against women continues to be. And that makes it more important than ever that we speak up and act so as to demonstrate our complete rejection of the hatred toward women represented by this tragic day in history and by the continuing violence we unfortunately see every day. Every single one of us has a responsibility to recognize this continuing violence and misogyny for exactly what it is: hatred, discrimination, violence, and loss of life, which are all inconsistent with prevailing Canadian values and beliefs. We know that part of the solution rests in reversing broader inequalities, which have been made worse by the pandemic, and ensuring that those who have paid a bigger price during this crisis, women included, are given the support they need to recover and to move forward. So let's agree that we'll all work on building that culture of courage and nonviolence, that culture of respect and equity, which will ensure that without exception, Canadian women can live their lives in safety with truly equal opportunity in front of them, knowing they are free from discrimination and violence.
Thank you, Mayor Tory. As you know, the success of our city depends on strong community support and ensuring we connect with some of our most underserved populations. The pandemic has shone a light on the inequities that exist, and we are grateful for your ongoing commitment to improve the lives of all Torontonians. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Tanya Sharp. Dr. Sharp is the founder and director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, also known as the CRIB. The CRIB is an interdisciplinary community-based social work research center dedicated to reducing service inequities for communities of Black survivors of homicide victims by advancing collaborative, culturally responsive research, restorative policy, and evidence-based practice. Dr. Sharp is a community-based researcher who is passionately committed to the development of innovative approaches and sustainable opportunities, allowing Black communities to thrive in the face of homicide violence. Her research examines sociocultural factors that influence the coping strategies of Black family members and friends of homicide victims. She has developed culturally appropriate interventions and best practices designed to assist African American survivors of homicide victims in the management of their grief and bereavement. As mentioned earlier, please feel free to send your questions through the Q&A feature, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Please welcome Dr. Sharp.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And without further ado, let me begin. I'm tired. Really tired. And if I'm really honest, I'm angry. I can't keep doing this. We can't keep doing this. It feels good to talk about it now, out in the open. But the weight of it, day after day, generation after generation, is slowly killing us, even when we are not the direct recipients of the bullets. Have you ever heard the sound of a mother wailing for her children? I remember the first time I saw a silent scream. It was the photograph of Emmett Till's mother leaning over his casket. But the first time I heard a silent scream was when my aunt leaned over the casket of her 25-year-old son, my cousin. I'll never forget it. My knees buckled when I heard it. Her scream was so hauntingly silent. The pain on her face was so great that it restricted her vocal cords like a thick layer of smoke does when a fire rages. We, as Black people, are a hashtag away from extinction. Black lives don't matter. There, I said it. Now what do we do with it? So I thought it most appropriate to enter the space apart and yet together, using a different approach, one that allows us, no, it demands that we honor our loved ones and we also speak our truths, even when our voices may shake. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today for the purpose of remembering and honoring those who are no longer physically with us, but whose presence, whose essence, if you will, lives on within us. The ones left behind, surviving the storm of their loved one's tragic death. Just trying to share the screen in my, here we go. For over 2 decades, I've been developing a program of research for and with, and in collaboration with Black surviving family members and friends of homicide victims. A topic that has real world implications to spaces and places throughout our global community. Chicago, Illinois, Johannesburg, South Africa, Kingston, Jamaica, Baltimore, Maryland, and yes, also right here in Canada. In short, no one is immune. However, I want to provide a bit of context relevant to homicide so that we can properly situate ourselves in today's discussion and understand that while no one is immune to homicide, there are populations that are disproportionately impacted by homicide. And this phenomenon is deeply rooted in structures of inequity that permeate the very fabric of our society. But that, my friends, is a discussion for another time. Let me provide some context. Homicide victims in the United States, on average, 17,000 homicides occur each year in the US. And Black people make up only 13.3% of the population and yet account for close to half, 47%, of homicide victims. Homicide victims in Canada. On average, 600 homicides occur each year in Canada. And while race-based data collection is fairly new to Canada, StatsCan just released this past October that in 2019, for the first time, they revised the homicide survey to collect information on whether victims were visible minorities. They found that 1/3 of homicide victims were racialized and 44% of those were Black. So if Black people account for 3.4% of Canada's total population and yet account for more than half, close to half of homicide victims throughout the country, we are certainly dealing with disproportionate inequity in the Black community when it comes to homicide. I want to shift our focus for a moment now that we've situated ourselves in understanding the magnitude of homicide victimization in Black communities and focus on the survivors, the family members and friends left behind to navigate their grief journey. Redmond and Doka suggest that on average, Each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members and friends who must learn how to cope with the homicide of their loved one. However, I want us to reflect on a couple of things here. The first being that for many Black people, we have familiar relationships with many individuals, not necessarily related by blood, and we do not make distinctions between the two. And so our relationship to one another extends far beyond blood ties and country borders, making the ripple effect, if you will, an impact of the storm of homicide far reaching, suggesting that we are dealing with a disproportionate number of Black people who are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. The second point I want to make, the Black population here in Canada predominantly consists of people of African and Caribbean descent. So when a homicide occurs here in Canada or in one's home country, surviving family members and friends are riddled with traumatic grief and devastation, indicating that we have a global community of Black survivors of homicide victims facing a pandemic of grief. There is one final point I want to make here. My research indicates that on average, each Black person will experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime. Let me say that again. On average, each Black person will experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime. And we know that homicide-related death has a devastating impact on the mental, the physical, and spiritual well-being of individuals and communities who must face the daunting challenge of learning to cope with the murder of their loved ones. Experiencing the murder of a loved one leaves survivors with invisible wounds that often go undetected to the untrained eye, and they appear in the form of complicated or elongated grief, emotional numbing, a lack of motivation, traumatic stress, depression, hypervigilance, etc., etc. Imagine, just imagine, if you will, what happens to communities who experience this devastation day after day, generation after generation? How many times can they weather the storm of homicide? How do Black people navigate the wreckage when they are not privileged with the opportunity to catch their breath? And who hears their cries? I'll circle back to that in a moment. Black survivors of homicide victims are not a monolith. This understanding is not only relevant when we consider ethnicity, nationality, religion, and gender, particularly as it pertains to the disproportionate impact of homicide on surviving women. However, research that focuses specifically on uplifting the voices of mothers, grandmothers, daughters, sisters, nieces, and partners of homicide victims is limited, with the exception of a few scholars. Let me introduce you to them. Our very own Annette Bailey, who is a professor, associate professor at Ryerson, looked at Black mothers who experienced the murder of a child due to gun violence. And her findings illustrated that the mothers find meaning and achieving personal growth were influenced by social and cultural factors and grounded in spirituality. Their coping strategies, their ability to survive perhaps even thrive another day, was really dependent on a social, cultural context, if you will, their ability to reach into spiritual coping resources to be able to overcome such devastation. Team Robert Neumeier and McDavitt also looked at a large sample of survivors of homicide victims, the majority of which were women, and found that nearly half of the participants screened positive for issues of depression, complicated grief, PTSD, and anxiety, even years after the loss. So the idea that someone is going to heal from this or get over this, and when we think about the fact that Black people on average experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime, we understand that the manifestation of traumatic grief is very, very great, particularly when we think about women who are surviving the loss of so many disproportionately murdered Black men. Being Black, in short, being Black, being a woman, being a survivor of a homicide victim is indeed the perfect storm leading to a traumatically siloed pandemic of grief. While my work and the scholarship of a handful of others have made significant contributions to the field, there are some gaps that remain. And we must galvanize our resources to address them. For example, research on homicide violence focuses primarily on the victim and the perpetrator and not the survivor. Research on Black, African, and Caribbean survivors of homicide victims is limited, but particularly when we scale it down to their experiences on an individual and community level, when we think about gender, demographics, what are the experiences of women? Even though we know that some of the research that has been conducted relevant to survivors of homicide victims, the participants have been majority women, we haven't fully taken a deeper dive, if you will, into their unique experiences, age, etc. We also need to look at the fact that if we think about wherever Black people are throughout this global community, they disproportionately experience homicide violence. We have a responsibility to examine what homicide violence and victimization and survivorship looks like throughout the African diaspora. We need to further examine coping strategies. What's the impact of experiencing the homicide on our mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, particularly when we think about women being at the forefront, being the matriarch of many families. What does that mean to experience the chronic annihilation of your own people? Where are women? Where are their children drawing upon for services and culturally responsive services? And how are they going about utilizing these services? And we need to focus on creating culturally responsive programming and tools of management as well. So in order to address these gaps in research, it was critically important to begin this work by listening to the voices of those directly impacted. In fact, listening to the voices of survivors and actually hearing the cries is what drew me to this work. There is one survivor whose voice in particular I'll never forget. Her name is Edna. Before entering grad school, I was working at the Harvard School of Public Health, Division of Public Health Practice, working side by side with families who were surviving the homicide of a loved one in their efforts to create violence prevention programs. And while doing that work, I met Edna. And when I met Edna, Edna had just experienced the murder of her son. So a bunch of us who worked together went down to the church to pay our respects. And when I entered the church, I extended my hand and I said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Edna looked at me with disdain and said, "I didn't lose my son. He was taken from me." In that moment, that exact moment, two things became abundantly clear. If I, as a trained social worker, even with the best of intentions, didn't know how to comfort her, to help her, to console her, how equipped would other service providers be? The other thing that kept playing in my head was, how would Edna go about surviving the murder of her son? It is with this insight, this gift, if you will, that Edna gave me, that it became clear that this was not only a professional mission of mine, but it was very personal. And so for me, this is not work that I do, but is a calling. I wanted to hear more of the voices. So I conducted in-depth interviews with so many others like Edna. And that allowed me to hear what Black survivors were saying about the influence of who they are, the obstacles that they face, and the impact of those experiences on helping them to navigate the wreckage of homicide. Let me show you. Alexander and Ho refer to cultural trauma, if you will, to describe the experiences of being oppressed, marginalized, and disenfranchised based upon one's racial and or ethnic status. And so the following themes identified by, in this case, African-American survivors of homicide victims fall under that domain. Ancestral survivorship. Margaret, a surviving grandparent, stated, "I just have confidence in African-Americans' ability to be a people and understand from whence we came and understand how much baggage we've been able to destroy or clean up or whatever it is that we have had to deal with that I don't think we were born to bear. I believe the ability of my people to overcome so much, so many things, and still have not truly, in my opinion, arrived at first-class recognition by many, many people. We are still, I think, some of the greatest achievers there are." So what Margaret was really describing was Black survivors understanding that because you come from ancestors who have survived slavery, who have continued to survive oppression, marginalization, institutional racism, surely we should be able to survive anything that comes our way. Under the same domain of cultural trauma, survivors describe anticipated hardship. I'm trying to make sure that you understand that one of the reasons for me, I dare say the majority of African Americans and people of color, the reason we keep things to ourselves is life is supposed to have a little bit of pain. You know, no sunshine without the rain. We grew up with those kind of anecdotes that make us hold things in. This is Elaine, a surviving aunt. I want you all to keep your eye on Elaine. We'll circle back to Elaine in a moment. So with this understanding of cultural trauma, it's important to note that Black survivors of homicide victims were describing the fact that just because they are Black and we live in a racist society, that they anticipate that there is going to be hardship. They anticipate that they are going to experience racism, and that there are significant messages that were taught from their ancestors about how to manage such trauma, even before a homicide happens. But then a homicide occurs. And what survivors describe to me is what I call culture, the culture of homicide. Survivors entering into a culture that was altogether unique, where shame and stigma were paramount. This is Malik, a surviving cousin. I try to cope now by not being ashamed to talk about it, because I was ashamed to talk about it, especially being African American and the stereotypes of African Americans, that we are just prone to this. And you know, like every time I tell people this, not every time, I'm exaggerating now a bit here, but someone says, you know, "Oh, is it drug related?" Like this is the first thing that pops out of their mouths. Under the Same domain, culture of homicide, blame. I question whether or not there was something I could have done to keep him out of that environment. And therefore, perhaps this never would have occurred. So I guess I'm saying, in some sense, I'm always questioning whether or not I'm particularly or a bit somehow responsible for his tragic death. This is Elaine. Her nephew used to come and visit her every summer. The one summer he didn't come to visit was the summer he was murdered. A lack of justice. I remember my brother was like, we all know who did it, and the problem is the police aren't doing anything about it. My brother was like, I know who it is. You know, we all know who it is, because my cousin was apparently not the right target. It is unsolved, and we just feel like they, meaning the police, don't care. Over and over again, these are common beliefs of Black survivors of homicide victims. If it takes too long for police to show up to the crime scene, if the murder goes unsolved, etc., etc. So when we think about cultural trauma and we think about the culture of homicide, the work of Lazarus and Folkman helps to explain some of this. They talk about, a stress and coping theory, that someone may experience a stressor and they look to emotion-focused resources, whether I'm going to cry about it or scream, or problem-focused coping strategies. I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to, pay for funeral home expenses. But there was something unique going on that dictated coping strategies for Black survivors of homicide victims. There was something going on between this interaction between cultural trauma and culture of homicide. My colleague and dear friend deemed it racial appraisal. He's a sociologist who basically said that racial appraisal, that individuals, Black survivors of homicide victims, weren't simply appraising the stressor of homicide, right? They weren't simply saying, I'm going to appraise it, to use emotion focused or problem focused, but it was being appraised through a racialized lens, if you will. And racial appraisal basically speaks to, for people of color, disenfranchised populations, if you will, racial appraisal consists of both culture and structure. Culture is a set of shared attitudes and beliefs about the way things should be done. And it is crucial to how people perceive and cope with trauma. Structure shapes those perceptions in that it dictates the distribution of resources. Race is a component of our social structure that allocates materials, goods, and services, social and psychological resources unevenly throughout our society, particularly as it pertains to Black people. And so racialized populations, like African Americans in this sample, appraise stressful encounters and assess coping resources based on this paradigm. And so with this understanding, the survivors that I spoke to identified specific coping strategies. Spiritual coping and meaning making. Spiritual coping. This is Elaine again. My grandmother used to say, if you have a problem, take it to God. She didn't say take it to the therapist. I believe in God, meaning making. I believe in God, but to a certain extent, because I don't think God takes an innocent baby or a person that good that wants to help the world. So I keep telling myself he probably needs another angel now. This is Langston, a surviving cousin. So the idea that I'm going to rely on my faith to be able to make sense, to make meaning, to help me cope. Maintaining a connection to the deceased. I try to cope with it by maintaining a personal connection with him, meaning like having conversations with him sometimes when things get difficult, or remembering that I don't want anybody else to have to deal with the kind of thing that I did. So almost talking to him or praying to him to get through not only the grief that I feel regarding his loss, but also to get through and do the work I need to do. This is Trinity, a surviving cousin, who's also, in fact, a social worker. Collective coping and caring. I really focused on what my family was going through rather than what I was going through. I was really like, what do you need? How do we get this together? So in many ways, that was my coping mechanism, by not dealing with it in many respects. So I focused my energies on helping other people. What's important to note here is most every survivor I talk to has one or two family members within the collective, if you will, that gathers the family together, that is responsible for making sure Auntie so-and-so can fly in for the funeral, pays for the burial. What was really unique about that experience is that those individuals were not necessarily garnering or relying on others for support. So this collective caring and coping left several individuals out of that particular formula or that narrative. Concealment. Here's Elaine. I think I tend to internalize and find a small part of my heart or a small part of my mind, an actual small closet in my heart or a small closet in my mind to shut off those things that bother me. I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather. There's a line in The Godfather where Michael says to his younger brother, you never speak against family. You never disagree with the family. You never go outside of the family. And I think that is just kind of my mantra. I'm just not of the belief that you go outside the home to garner assistance with family or personal problems. You may note that in the sample, the majority of the individuals are women. Elaine, who conceals her emotions because of fear of stigma, because of shame, because of blame. She also smoked a pack and a half of cigarettes a day, had diabetes, and high blood pressure. So there's a distinct correlation between the weight of the impact of homicide violence on not just our mental well-being, but certainly our physical well-being. So by listening to the voices, I was able to come up with a conceptual model of coping for African-American survivors of homicide victims that really suggests that when they wake up in the morning, simply because they are Black, they experience cultural trauma. We often hear about mothers who have talks with their sons, the talk about when you're pulled over by the police, you put your hands on the steering wheel, right? You're respectful. These kinds of things evolve from the idea of anticipated hardship, so forth and so on. And that cultural trauma, basically when a homicide occurs, they enter into a culture that's altogether unique. They appraise these stressors and they identify coping strategies to support their grief journey. And so what are the implications really with this understanding that we can begin to go about the necessary thing of responding to the needs of Black survivors of homicide victims in a culturally responsive way through research, policy, and practice? It starts with doing research, again, for and with community, in partnership with community that are impacted. It also needs to begin with developing tools of measurement. Currently, I've taken that model and I was able to develop an intervention, and that intervention, I was able to develop a tool of measurement. We need to begin with the voices of those impacting to develop culturally responsive tools to accurately assess their experiences. We currently also, again, research is limited, so we need to explore the experiences of African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims, particularly looking at some of the things that you mentioned in the introduction of our time here today. The homicide type. Was the homicide due to police state-sanctioned violence? Was the homicide interpersonal violence? Was the homicide due to intimate partner violence? These characteristics are important for us to uplift and to be able to examine further. Also, again, homicide violence in terms of how is it impacting our mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. When we think about policy, collecting homicide prevalence data by race and ethnicity is so important. The fact that StatsCan in 2019 made some changes to the survey to be able to do that is a step in the right direction, but we do need to continue to contextualize these experiences by uplifting those voices. I also think about the mothers movement in the United States and how these moms, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner's, were able to transform their pain into policy. How are we supporting the mothers who are leading these movements and not just moving from a moment in time, but solidifying it in policy so that that moment transforms into a movement that can inform policy and service delivery? I also think this uplifts because of the frequency with homicide violence occurs in Black communities, that we must do a better job of collecting the trauma histories of individuals, families, and community. there are opportunities that we are missing in our primary care physician rooms, in our educational classrooms, to be able to assess the trauma histories of individuals. And we have to do that, particularly if we are to understand what the impact of the chronic exposure to homicide violence is impacting on these communities. Programming and interventions must be culturally aware and responsive with these voices in mind. And what an opportunity. What an opportunity if we uplift the voices of individuals, develop conceptual models, develop interventions, but then we can better inform service providers who survivors rely upon to not just survive this tragedy, but to perhaps thrive thereafter it. That requires us to educate and train social workers, EMTs, medical health professionals, police, faith-based communities, et cetera, et cetera. So at the Crib, we are beginning to do some of that work. We were honored enough to receive SHIRK funding to in the next semester, or sorry, I'm thinking about semesters because I teach, but in the spring, launching the Invisible Wounds Project, which is the first study of its kind dedicated to uplifting the voices of African, Caribbean, Black survivors of homicide victims here in Canada. And we are also working in partnership with CMHA to uplift the voices of Indigenous and Black survivors of homicide, Black racialized survivors of homicide victims, for the purpose of being able to help service providers engage with survivors of homicide victims in a culturally responsive manner. The other thing that we're working on at the Crib is that the tool of measurement that I developed, the inventory of coping for African American survivors of homicide victims, we are adapting that to the Canadian context for African, Caribbean, and Black people. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. We have one question that came through that actually builds on your last point or your last slide about resources. And it's are there any resources you can recommend to clinicians to learn more about providing culturally informed care that takes into account patients' lived experiences? I know you mentioned Crib. Are there other?
Yes. So if you certainly visit our website, we have several articles that I've published relevant to the coping strategies of African American survivors of homicide victims. And I also would take a look at Annette Bailey's work, who really talks about the coping strategies specifically of Black surviving moms, really talking about inviting the whole person, if you will, into the room, considering how do they cope from a spiritual vantage point, what sort of barriers are they facing when it comes to engaging with service delivery. And so those are the kinds of things that I would definitely take a look at to be able to be better informed. And we're trying to create that as well. So.
Thank you very much. That was our only question today. So Dr. Sharp, on behalf of everyone who attended today and the Women's College Hospital community, I wanted to sincerely thank you for generously sharing your time and your expertise, as well as your passion and compassion for this area. I know personally you've enriched my knowledge and understanding and provided a valuable voice to the challenges facing Black women and families. Thank you.
Thank you.
On a snowy winter's day in Fredericton, New Brunswick, several years ago, Leslie Monahan stood on the steps of legislature in a vigil remembering the victims of violence. Struck by the silhouettes against the rain and snow, standing together quietly, but with purpose, the words to a song came to her. I'll Stand in the Rain honors the women and children killed each year by a domestic partner. I invite you to listen to this song in silent reflection and in remembrance of the 33 women and 2 children who were murdered in our province this year.
I'll stand beside you each step of the way. I'll see you through. There's work left to do, so no more lives will be lost in vain. I'll stand in the rain. I'll take my place, though you can't see my face. You can't see my eyes, all the tears that I've cried. You can't feel my heart, but I'll do my part to bring awareness from out of the dark. I'll do my part. I'll stand in the rain, I'll stand in the snow. I'll carry my message wherever I go, to bring peace and healing, to help the world's pain. I'll stand in the rain. I'll stand in the rain, I'll weather each storm, in hopes that compassion will one day be the norm. My voice may be gone, but my spirit is strong. I'll stand in the rain. Don't turn away, don't close your eyes. My friend, it's time to realize there's a lot to do. So reach out your hand, we'll heal the pain across this land. Together we'll stand. We'll stand in the rain, we'll stand in the snow. We'll carry our message so people will know. Our voices are gone, but our spirits live on. We'll stand in the rain. We'll stand in the rain, we'll weather each storm, in hope that compassion will one day be the norm. Our voices are silent, our spirits remain. We'll stand in the rain. If we all work together, we'll see a new day. We'll stand in the rain. Our voices are gone, but our spirit lives on.
Every year, we light candles and present roses in honor of the 14 women murdered at École Polytechnique, as well as for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and all women who are victims of intimate partner violence. This year, we will also be recognizing Black women in honor of the Say Her Name movement. This year, we virtually gathered 17 representatives from our community to pay tribute.
Hélène Gauguin.
Geneviève Bergeron. may.
Maud Havernick.
Maryse Lazarnier.
Nathalie Croteau.
Annie Saint Arnaud.
Maryse Leclerc.
Sonia Pelletier.
Michel Richard.
Annie Turcotte.
Barbara Kluzitnik-Vidayevich.
Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
For the Say Her Name movement and the Black women and girls who experience violence. Our lives matter.
All victims of gender-based violence.
I would now like to ask for a minute of silent reflection. To close today's event, I would now like to share remarks from the Chair, Women's College Hospital Board of Directors, Tammy Brown.
Every year, this ceremony serves as a reminder that violence against women and girls remains prevalent and knows no social, economic, or national boundaries. This is why we continue to mark this important day and say the names of women and children across the province who've lost their lives to domestic violence, and we also honor all those who've experienced gender-based violence. Today is an opportunity to raise awareness and continue having conversations that lead to action and drive change. This includes acknowledging that some women continue to experience disproportionate rates of violence. We know that Indigenous and Black women face higher rates of violence, as well as ongoing institutional racism and racial profiling when trying to access the services that are supposed to help them. This must not go forgotten or ignored. We must continue working to apply an anti-racism lens to everything we do and dismantling the barriers they face to care. As a healthcare organization built on equity, we know it's our duty to advocate for this change both today and every day. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us in marking the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. On behalf of Women's College Hospital Board, the hospital's leadership, I'd also like to extend a thanks to our government and community partners for being part of the ceremony today. Thank you, Minister Elliott, Minister Dunlop, Mayor Tory, and Councillor Layton for for your continued support on this very important issue, and all of our partners across the system and government for your commitment to our community. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Tanya Sharp for her insightful keynote address. Your research is so important to us. Thank you for sharing it with us. And finally, thank you to all of our rose holders who took the time to be part of this year's event. We appreciate you helping us continue this beautiful and important ceremony, even under these very strange and different circumstances. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Tammy. I would also like to add my thanks to Minister Bennett, Minister Elliott, Minister Dunlop, Mayor Tory, and everyone who was part of our rose ceremony today. And thank you to Dr. Sharp for sharing her insightful work, and to all of you who joined us today. I encourage you to be safe and to be kind to one another. These are trying times, but if we can all come together, better times lie ahead. Take care.